Hey folks, Mr. Olson here. Let's do some econ. We are in unit 6 of micro, looking at market failures. And this is topic 6.3, looking at private versus public goods. A warm-up question for you to think about as we introduce this topic. What's the difference between installing a new bathroom in a house and building a municipal sewage system? What's the difference between growing wheat and fishing in the ocean? So think for a couple minutes about what's different about those projects and those industries. And ultimately, it comes down to something called types of goods or the four types of goods. So we're going to categorize goods into four categories based on whether or not they're rival and whether or not they're excludable. There are private goods, artificially scarce goods, also known as club goods, common resources, and then public goods. For most of our course, we've been focusing up here in the top left on private goods. Private goods are rival in consumption, which means if I consume it, you cannot consume that same unit of the good, and they're excludable. It's really easy for firms to exclude people who didn't pay from using it. A good example of a private good is a pair of jeans. It's really easy for a company to sell me a pair of jeans. If you don't pay for jeans, they can easily exclude you from using them. And if I buy a pair of jeans, then it's really, really hard for another person to use that same pair of jeans at the same time, right? Same thing with Samsung smartphones. And most goods, in fact, most goods where markets tend to work really well in distributing. Okay. Um, the other category over here on the top right is artificially scarce goods, or also known as club goods. These are excludable, but they're actually non-rival. So Netflix subscriptions is a good example of this. Netflix's marginal cost of adding one more user is really, really low. And unless their servers are like overwhelmed, if there's more people viewing it, you're not necessarily getting in the way of someone else watching the same streaming service. However, based on password protection and accounts, it is an excludable service, which allows companies to join the industry and become profitable. Okay. Common resources are non-excludable, but they're rival. Okay. These are common resources like clean water, biodiversity, clean air, protection of the atmosphere from climate change. And this is a real challenge to markets because there's a limited rival use of these things, but we cannot exclude free riders from them. Okay, so we're going to need more government policy to deal with that. And we're going to need lots of government policy for this last category of goods down here in the bottom right, which is called public goods. Public goods are both non-rival and they're non-excludable. And I'll talk about them in more depth later in this lesson. Okay. There's a whole subcategory of economics for it called environmental economics or the economics of pollution. Super interesting. And it's a growing field in the 21st century as we try to use the tools of incentives and analyses of economics to apply it to protecting the environment. You probably thought about it a little bit in that warm up. Public bathrooms are so gross because of something called the tragedy of the commons. It's sometimes called the common pool problem. And the tragedy of commons basically says that goods are available to everyone, like the air, oceans, lakes, public bathrooms are often polluted since no one has the personal incentive to keep them clean. Okay. There's no monetary incentive for individuals to use them efficiently. So there's going to be high spillover cost in terms of future use. And one great example of this is overfishing in the ocean. And even though we'd all be better off if fishermen and fisherwomen limited their fishing now so the stock wouldn't be depleted, without intervention, the incentives line up so people would fish more now because they can't control what other people are going to do. And we ended up with overfishing. So that's the tragedy of the commons. What can government do about the tragedy of the commons? Well, one policy option is governments selling the right to pollute. So this is basically the idea of cap and trade. So let's assume in this little society that the lake could absorb 500 gallons of pollutants each year, and we have all these factories polluting the lake. The government could sell each firm its right to pollute a certain number of gallons. This would allow you to internalize that externality, internalize spillover costs that the firms weren't calculating for. And then once you make them pay to pollute, they change the incentive structure. And now these firms have the incentive to become cleaner and pollute less because it would lower their cost. Okay, another version of this is like a cap and trade where you can trade extra units of pollution. So not only if this firm that was producing 200 gallons a year became a lot more efficient and they had purchased those extra rights to pollute, they could sell them to other firms in a cap and trade market, which would allow them to, which would allow other firms to internalize external costs if they weren't efficient enough yet. So this is a pretty popular regime. The European Union is doing it for carbon emissions now. They have a cap and trade regime. There is a history of cap and trade in the US that was relatively successful, and that was limits on pollutants that caused acid rain. So ask your parents about this. In the 90s, acid rain was a huge problem, and industrial production led to a lot of chemicals contributing to acid rain, and the US imposed a cap and trade system, and it led to a huge improvement on much greener and lowering greener industries, and acid rain is basically a non-issue now because it changed the incentives for firms to, from polluting whatever the different elements were that caused acid rain. So that's the kind of a example of success on that policy front. So let's see. Speaking of common resources in public sectors, as we think about and public goods, as we think about who produces what in our society, you can imagine for a minute what would it be like if there was no government. How would schools and parks and freeways work? Would there be different? There would probably be some private schools, some private roads, some private parks, but there certainly wouldn't be enough to meet our needs, right? So thinking back earlier to this unit when we talked about marginal social costs and marginal social benefit, and if we're going to get to the optimum number of those things for society, we're going to need the government to intervene to produce them. There's no way that the free market produces enough of those. This leads to the idea of public sectors and private sectors. So public sectors are the part of the economy that is primarily controlled by the government, and the private sector is a part of the economy that is run by private individuals and companies that are seeking profit. Be careful on this because the public sector is just controlled by the government, but everything in the public sector is not the market for true public goods. Okay, so the government's going to do a lot of things in the public sector that's actually producing common resources or artificially scarce goods, or in some cases private goods as well. Okay, but in terms of who's controlling it, we want to differentiate between the public and the private sector. Why do we need the government when we start analyzing public goods? Why do we need the government to produce them? It's because there's not going to be any profit for firms to produce enough of them. And this is due to something called the free rider problem. Okay, and the free rider problem is caused by when individuals benefit without paying. So if you benefit from a good or service without actually paying for that, then you are a free rider. And whoever is running this sunset viewing business at the beach doesn't understand that problem because why would you buy a $10 ticket from this, folks, when you could free ride and watch a sunset on your own? So that's not a very good business model there. The free rider problem is everywhere and applies to a variety of goods and services. If people who download music or movies illegally on the internet, they're free riders, right? They're benefiting from that good without actually contributing and paying for it. If you ever watch a street performer and don't pay, don't put some money in the hat, you're a free rider. And I won't read that third one because it could be hitting a little too close to home. Okay, so free rider problem applies to a lot of things. So this is just kind of a thought-provoking infographic looking at U.S. Military spending, which is super, super high. And that means that Canada, our northern neighbor, is protected by the U.S. military installation. So why doesn't Canada spend more on their military? Commonly people talk about, a non-militant culture for the Canadians, which certainly could be true. But on the other hand, they are getting protection from the U.S. military establishment. And some people would say they're benefiting as free riders because Canadian taxpayers aren't contributing to that service. So, so free riders are a huge problem because they prevent companies from making profits. And if we left those industries where free riders were common to the free market, then those services would be underproduced. We would not have enough. So what can the government do to intervene and solve the free rider problem? Number one, you got to find new ways to punish free riders. So if you ever ride the train without a ticket and you get caught for it, having a higher and higher citation costs for that is a way to discourage free riders. Or you can use taxpayer dollars to provide the service to everyone. So that's the other solution. If there's too many free riders in a particular industry, then you just say the government is going to tax everyone in the society for it and then provide that service for free. This is taking a free rider problem and turning it into a forced rider problem, where you say, you know what, we can't stop people from doing this. We're going to provide it for everyone and use tax dollars to do so. Okay. All right, let's move to our formal definition of public goods. So the public sector and governments do provide a wide variety of goods and services, but as economists, if we're defining true public goods, like I said earlier in the lesson, we're going to define them as non-exclusionary and non-rival, okay? And you have to have these two strict criteria in order to be a true public good. If something is non-exclusionary, you cannot exclude people from enjoying the benefits, even if they don't pay. And a great example of this is national defense. So national defense is a true public good, and one of the reasons that it's non-exclusionary. You can't exclude people from being protected by, say, a missile defense program, even if they don't pay. So if I didn't pay my taxes and all of your families paid your taxes, if God forbid a missile attack came over the Pacific from North Korea, then the US military installation stopped that attack. There's no way of stopping me from benefiting from that, even if I didn't pay my taxes, right? So based on that scenario and the issues coming up with it, it's definitely going to be a true public good. And then the second criteria is shared consumption, also known as non-rivalry. And this means that one person's consumption of a good does not reduce its usefulness to others. So a street light is a true public good. And it's because it's non-exclusionary, but also because it's non-rival. If I'm walking down the street at night and being protected and enjoying the light of a street light, it doesn't stop you from walking down the street and enjoying it, and it doesn't stop another person from driving down the road and enjoying it. So we're not consuming the same unit at the same time. So it's going to be non-rival. Okay, so it again, true public goods have to have both of those criteria. So take a look at this list and tell me which of these 6 items are true public goods. So you can pause it, take a stab at it on your own, and then hit play when you're done. All right, the only true public good on this list are number 5, streetlights. Okay, now this is confusing for a lot of students because some of these goods are provided by the government, so they're part of the public sector, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily a true public good, right? The government can provide club goods, the government can provide private goods, the government can provide any kind of good that the society decides should be part of the private sector. Okay, the only difference here is if it's a true public good, the only way that that good is going to be produced is if the government produces it. Okay, so hamburgers are private goods. Satellite TV is a club good. It's artificially scarce. So it is excludable, but it's non-rival. Okay, free public education is technically education is excludable, and rival. MIDI is a great example of how you can make education excludable, right? If you don't pay your tuition and you don't get an acceptance letter, then unfortunately you're not able to come, right? So free public education is not a true public good. The free market would underproduce education because there's lots and lots of positive externalities to education. So we definitely want the government involved to education so we can get to that socially optimum outcome. right? That doesn't mean that it's a true public good. Homes are private goods. Streetlights are a true public good because they're truly non-excludable and truly non-rival. And as opposed to markets where there's externalities, streetlights would not be produced at all because there's no room for any kind of private sector profit with true public goods, right? Whereas other things the government involved in, we might have some private sector, and we just haven't got to our socially optimum outcome. For true public goods, you usually would argue, gosh, those aren't going to be produced at all without the government. Okay, and then same thing for highways, right? Highways have lots of positive externalities, so we would probably be underproduced by the private sector. There are private highways, right? Fast Track in the Bay Area is an example of that. Toll roads, but highways are not true public goods because they are excludable. Okay, hopefully that helps a little bit. A lot of students have a hard time coming up with examples of true public goods because there actually are not that many, right? So disease prevention for society is a true public good. Public sanitation, scientific research, and then a lighthouse is another classic example of a true public good that are non-rivalrous and non-exclusionary. And all these things are also not going to be produced without the public sector providing them. Okay, so in sum, there are 4 categories of goods. And as economists, we define public goods really narrowly, right? Even just because something's produced by the government doesn't mean it's a true public good. It's got to be a non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Okay. Ultimately, how involved the government gets into the economy is a social question, right? So how big the public sector is versus the private sector is, how many regulations you have on to protect the environment, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all going to be social, political questions. And economists hopefully help us understand what the trade-offs are involved in those things. But the only thing economists are going to tell us, no doubt about it, is the government must provide true public goods. And beyond that, it's a social, political question. Thanks so much for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day.